I went to Montana to have a look at the ranch that Savage did live on, but actually it wasn't the house of my imagination or the fiction of the story. And we didn't find any ranch houses in Montana that could be renovated economically to tell our story. It became clear that it would be easier for us to work in New Zealand. We have an amazing landscape there. And if it could be Middle Earth, it could be Montana for us. Those are words from director Jane Campion on deciding to shoot in New Zealand versus America for a 2021 film, The Power of the Dog. Seeing Faces in Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or cinematographer. And each week I invite a guest on to discuss a film and the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia, and today we're talking about Power of the Dog. So, quick synopsis of the film is, charismatic rancher Phil Burbank inspires fear and awe in those around him. When his brother brings home a new wife and her son, Phil torments them until he finds himself exposed to the possibility of love. Tagline for the film is, What It Means to Be a Man. The film stars Benedict Cumberbatch as Phil Burbank, Jesse Plemons as George Burbank, Kirsten Dunst as Rose Gordon, and Cody Smith-McPhee as Peter Gordon. It's written by Jane Campion, based on the novel by Thomas Savage, cinematography by Ari Wegner, directed by Jane Campion, edited by Peter Chaberas, and music by Jonny Greenwood. Today, my guest is Emily Gagne, and I know her from her work as a co-curator for a film program in Toronto at Review Cinema called We Really Like Her, and it focuses on women in film. So before we get into Jane Campion and Power of the Dog, Emily, thank you so much for joining the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Felicia. This is a dream to come on the show and to talk about Jane Campion. What a treat.
Truly, it's been really, really great revisiting a lot of her work. And before we get into the film, I'd love for you to tell the audience a bit about, your work as a film programmer, and then we can get into how you started watching films and what turned you into wanting to program films in the city.
Sure. So We Really Like Her started as a podcast, actually. We had a podcast before We Really Like Her called What About Meryl, which was about Meryl Streep. And we talked about the filmography of Meryl Streep. And so we went through a bunch of her movies, not every single one, but a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And we watched them, my partner and I, Danita Steinberg. We loved that. And then we ended the Meryl podcast. We finished all the movies and we're like, what do we do now? And we realized over the course of doing that podcast that we love talking about women in particular, not just actresses, but filmmakers, screenwriters, costume designers, etc., and highlighting women. Like Anne Roth does a lot of costumes for Meryl, for example. It kept coming up, and we were like, Anne Roth, she's just the best. So we're like, how can we continue highlighting women? So we started the podcast We Really Like Her, where we highlighted a different woman in film, whether that was an actress or a director or writer or whatever. Like Diablo Cody is an example of a writer that we did, who I love. And so we decided that we would highlight women in film, and we did the podcast for a while. And then we sort of asked the review if we could do, an event to support our podcast. Yeah. And they said yes. We'd worked with them once before for a screening of Postcards from the Edge, which was tied to the Meryl podcast. And so they said yes. And we did Mermaids, was our first screening we ever did. Which I love. I love that film. And then they were like, yeah, you can continue doing it. And so we went from there. And really our whole thing is that we want to highlight women filmmakers, like women directors, and show films like whether they're, a little more niche, like Working Girls, made by Lizzie Borden, which is one that we screened in November, or, like the biggest movies of all time, like Mamma Mia is a film that we screen like once a year because it is a true triumph of spirit, but also a box office like hit. And so it's so important to honor women, not only as like creative geniuses, but also of like financial geniuses. So, so that's pretty much what We Really Like Her is about. And like next month being February at this time of recording, I don't know when this is coming up, but we're doing a Barbie screening, like a drunken cinema Barbie screening. So that's highlighting the, box office part of it. But then we're doing Josie and the Pussycats, which is a co-written and co-directed by Deborah Kaplan. And that film is just so incredible.
Oh yeah, it's a masterpiece.
So that's what we do. And it's really just a celebration is what I like to think of it as, an opportunity for you to like just appreciate women's work.
Which is great. You know, we don't get that as much as we should. And I really do appreciate the films that you have put on. One of them being one of my favorites, and I will bring it up in this because I think that Jane for sure, this is a specific scene that I'm pretty sure was inspired by Yentl. And I think that's a great film to champion because people really don't give it its due at all. So I'll be gushing about Yentl a little bit as we talk about this film. But
I love that.
Oh, it's great. I love it. Do you recall the first time you watched this film? It's actually the newest film I've done on this podcast so far. So it's a couple of years old at this point, but do you recall when you watched it, what your initial thoughts were on the film?
Yeah, I watched it as part of TIFF. It screened as part of TIFF, but I think it was the year that it was sort of a hybrid festival. It was a little bit in person and then it was online. And so I was able to watch it online. And so I watched it at home and I was so excited to watch it. It was like one of my like top picks of the festival. I really liked it. But I remember being a little bit distracted in the TIFF haze where I was like on my phone a little bit. And this is a movie that I really think needs to be like watched. Like you need to pay attention because there's so many small little moments that if you look away for a second, you're going to miss it. And so I really liked it and I like championed it. But I think I liked it even more on this recent watch because I just really immersed myself in it. I was home alone. I just watched it by myself, with like a candle on, and I was really in it this time. And I wish I'd seen it in the theaters, to be honest. I just wish I'd seen it on the big screen. That's my regret.
I know. Same. I didn't get to see it in the cinema, and it really, especially even on this watch, where I'm like, oh man, my TV's not big enough for this.
No.
It's still a great watch. It's great that it's so accessible for people. And I think that's important because it is a Netflix film. And I was just thinking when I rewatched it, I was like, this was the best movie of the year. Like, hands down. There was just no competition for that year at all. But, and would you consider yourself a Campion fan? Or is this like a one-off, or do you like most of her work?
I like a lot of her work. I think like she's one that, of course, whenever you're talking about women in film or you're looking up women in film, she's like one of the first people that comes into conversation because she broke so much ground in terms of, being nominated for an Oscar and winning the Palme d'Or and all of these things. So she's talked about a lot, but I think like some of her smaller work isn't appreciated enough. So I didn't get to see it necessarily right away or didn't find it right away. But over time, I've come to appreciate her so much. And like the piano, like that movie is just unreal. Like I watched that movie and I'm like, this is why I love movies. Like it's so freaking good. But In the Cut is also exceptional. And I think what's so cool is like all of her movies are a little bit different, but they all feel connected despite being like entirely different in terms of plot. And I think like Power of the Dog is such a culmination of all of her work. It feels like a piece of all of different things that she's done throughout time. And so it makes me happy that she won an Oscar for this film because I feel like it's not only like an honorary Oscar for all of the work that she's done, but it feels like such a deserving Oscar.
Oh yeah. I would have been really like upset is an understatement. She hadn't won that year because she really deserved it. And I also like to think of it is sort of an honorary, but it's also like she very much deserved it for this film. It wasn't kind of like it's been too late, we got to give her one because we didn't give her one before. This was just an insane piece of work that every time I think of her, it's like I can't wait for the next one. And I hope it's not such a huge break between like this and what she did with Bright Star was like over 10 years. I hope it's not another 10 years.
I know. Well, I feel like her getting so much acclaim for it, working with Netflix, like I think that all of those things are like positive in terms of like getting her more funding to do other stuff. So I feel good about it, but you never know. Like women, that's the story with women. They succeed and then all of a sudden they make one little mistake, Ishtar, and then, it's over. So
It's unfortunate that hopefully they do her less dirty than they've done Elaine May.
Yeah, you could say that again.
Well, if you're ready and ready to get into the film itself, one of the first things I wanted to talk about doing research for this series and going back and rewatching basically all of her films, because she does have a smaller filmography. So it wasn't like having to watch 20, 30 movies. It was like a good 10, which is doable. The protagonists are always women. In this one, we get our first male protagonist, and it's very fitting for the story. And I think it's great what she did with this, because you get a lot of stories with characters that are unlikable as the protagonist, and that works and it doesn't work for some people. I think it works here. You're not supposed to like him. They never make you like him, but he's so watchable and you want to see what he's doing. And the way Phil operates in this film and interacts with everyone is just super toxic, even with himself. How do you feel about the choice? I know it's adapted from a novel, but the choice for her to adapt this novel knowing that this is going to be a male protagonist and showing how toxic he is versus the other work she's done.
Yeah. I mean, I always say that I think true feminism is being able to talk about men as well. Like, you can't just ignore the elephant in the room, which is that the patriarchy also affects men. And so I think it's actually like really cool to see her perspective, because she's so smart about gender roles and gender play. And she talks about that in every movie that she does, just from a different perspective. Like in The Cut, for example, is like, she talks about how dangerous it is to be a woman and how you're always looked at by men. So why not talk about sort of how a man looks at himself and how he wants to present himself? I think it's so much stronger coming from her than it would be coming from a man. Like I saw somebody tweet the other day, and it's truly how I feel, which is that women make the best movies about men because they can like look objectively at the situation and say, you know, like, this is what you're doing. And I think she does this so well, not just through Phil, but also even with George, and like how he kind of ignores things and just wants to keep the peace, you know, and like just how damaging expectations of gender are for everyone involved.
Yeah. I like what you said about it being a neutral view of it, because I never find that she's judging him too harshly. She's just presenting him as is. And it's up for us to be like, we agree with him or not. Most people are not going to agree with his choices and just how he interacts with even his own brother and the names that he calls him. But it never makes you feel like, you know, he's a true villain. He's a victim of multiple things that have happened in his life, and he just has no desire to grow and evolve from that.
Yeah.
Jane is the perfect person to do that, because she's so used to having those characters as like the foil to the woman in the film. So highlighting it here, you can't help but watch and kind of be amazed by this character and just his life choices with everything he does. So it's a great story and great choices from her. But this is also essentially a family movie. You know, we've got several different family dynamics. Essentially, there's about 5 of them that we can talk about individually, but there's Rose and Peter, which is mother and son. And there's George and Phil, brothers, George and Rose, husband and wife, Rose and Phil, in-laws, and then George and Peter, which is a smaller one, but I think it's worth noting. So if we talk about Rose and Peter first, which is a really sweet relationship, because this is a single mother who's working just to survive. She has her own cafe, bed and breakfast, and she's really sweet and accepting of her son's artistry and just his way of being, and doesn't question it. And they have a very sweet relationship where he calls her by her first name, and it's not, you know, patronizing. And she just accepts everything, and they accept each other, and they're supporting each other. And we get that opening quote from him where he's talking about his father passing and how he only wants her happiness, which comes into play a lot through the film. And it's not really until the end where you're like, wait a minute, didn't he just say essentially what he was going to do?
Yeah.
And I think that's just so beautifully done, especially when you rewatch it and you're like, okay, I hear you fully at this point. But how do you feel about their relationship and just the way that they are there for each other and how that evolves throughout the film?
Yeah, I mean, I think like you said, it is a beautiful relationship, and it is like you see so many portrayals of like young boys and their single moms, and they're like acting out, but he is just so supportive of her, and she is nurturing him in a time where she could say, oh, like that's, you know, that's too feminine of an activity for you to be doing, making these paper flowers, which the paper flowers are so beautiful. I want one. Like, so bad. But like, just to see, even like after Phil sets one of the flowers on fire at the table, which that infuriates me every time, even though I know it's going to happen. I'm just like,
Yeah.
that, how dare you do that? But he's trying to puff himself up and look cool and look masculine and assert his dominance. But she like subtly just like removes the vases from the table and like doesn't make a big deal about it, doesn't like say anything, but just is like, you're not going to destroy the rest of my boys' like work. You're just not going to do that. I'm not going to let that happen. And so I think that that's like so beautiful, and how she like also acts out later on in the film against Phil because she's feeling protective of Peter and like worried about him when she really doesn't have to be worried about him at all. He's a mastermind. Yeah. But I think it's just such a pure relationship, and between both of them they really care about each other, and I think that is a nice counterpoint to, you know, the like gruffness of Phil, to be like, you know, men can be caring and can, you know, stand up for the women in their life, which like I think George does to an extent too, but you know, Peter has been with her like forever and has been with her in the tough times too.
I like that scene that you mentioned about the vases, because I think that's who she is as a mother. She doesn't need to make a scene because she knows it's not worth her time and these people will not care. She's used to this behavior, and just removing it and being like, I'm going to take control of the situation without having to make a fuss about it because this is the only way I can control it. And I think that's just really great.
She also like wants to protect her job. Like this is her source of income. So she can't just blow up at this guy, even though she, I'm sure, wants to, because she's like, I need to make money from these people. I need to have them come back. I need to survive, because at that point she has no other way out. Like obviously later on she gets some money through marriage, but at that time, like she's got to look out for number one and number two, who is Peter, you know?
Yeah, I really love the way their relationship continues that way, and there was never a rift between them, because that really just would have been unfortunate for this story. But that brings us to George and Phil. The film opens up with Phil, and he's essentially stomping through the house as he would, and when he meets George, or he's calling George who's in the bath, he's calling him Fatso, and you see him throughout the film. That's how he refers to him. And George never says anything about it, but you can see on his face, Jesse Plemons is a great actor. He's so good in this role. You can see it, the little pang of pain every time he hears that. And it's weird because Phil he has a confidence there, but then as you see that he's not that confident. But when he's talking to people, he thinks he's the most confident person. And that's how he talks to George. Like, I am going to tell you what to do. This is how we're going to do it. You know, even the concept of George being in the bath and George saying, have you ever tried doing this? And Phil's like, why would I do that? Just their relationship really also made me sad, because you can see George not wanting to push his buttons. This is his brother. He knows him the best out of anyone would. But for anyone who has siblings who, you know, you don't want to get into a fight with them, you kind of just be like, well, that's the way they are. I'm not going to push it. So how do you read their relationship? And there is a progression there, more overt one between the two of them. And George changes his tune about Phil as the story goes on. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I always find it interesting how like they sleep in the same bed. Like that is like a little strange to me when they have a big house. I'm just like, okay. And that Phil cannot go to sleep without George. Like he's uncomfortable. Like it's like he needs his brother there, but also he's so rude to his brother. So you're like, he needs him and he like wants him by his side, but he also treats him like he doesn't want to have anything to do with him. And so it's like, it's such a like dick measuring contest kind of vibe to me, where Phil always feels like he can, you know, assert his power over George, and that's probably why he wants to be around him. But at the end of the day, Phil is just as damaged as anybody else, and like literally needs his brother to sleep with him, like not literally, but you know. And so I think it's I think it's such an interesting dynamic because it's presenting two sides of how men sort of deal with masculinity and like the pressures of it. One is going to just like act out and play the like stereotypical part. And the other one is going to like fall back a little and just let somebody else take the space because they're not ready to take on that role or they don't want to disturb the peace. And so what I like about George is over time, he sort of becomes a little bit more assertive, especially because he has this wife now that he wants to care for. And he's like, maybe I can stand my brother calling me fatso, but if he's gonna like act out against my wife, I don't know how I feel about that, And like, so it's interesting to see him step up, but I still think George is like a little bit meek even throughout. He's still not going to ever be Phil. And I don't know that that's a bad thing because Phil is just so heinous.
Yeah, truly. Yeah, George is interesting because he is really sweet, and you get that scene when the first scene that they're even together, him and Rose, where he goes back to pay the bill and he hears her crying and he goes to comfort her. So right off the bat, you're like, okay, if we didn't already see the difference between him and Phil, we now really see that this is someone. And it doesn't come across as like creepy, like he's trying to hit on her. He's just a nice guy who feels really bad because he knows how his brother is. Over time, he obviously falls for her. And there's this couple really cute scenes. She's swamped with work, and usually Peter helps her, and he just takes the towel and he starts serving people, and those people know him really well. They're just kind of in shock that he would be a servant of some sorts, and that's really sweet. I love that scene. It always makes me tear up. And there's another scene that really always just like, sometimes I had to look away because I'm like, this is too emotional for me. But when she's teaching him to dance, and he goes off to like shed a tear, and he's like, it's so nice to not be alone. I'm just like, Jane, please, I can't handle this. Like my heart, it's too much. That scene always stands out to me because that's how you know that she's in good hands with him. It takes time for her to finally feel happy again, but she's still in good hands with him. How do you feel about, their relationship and how it progresses and how it flowers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's beautiful. Like, I just think it's so nice to see somebody be kind to her because you get the sense, like, you only spend so much time with her, but you get the sense that she's just been treated badly her whole life. And obviously her first husband killed himself. So that's just like really hard. And the way that Kirsten Dunst like plays it is she's very tired and she's probably been like working her ass off for years trying to support her and her son, and not like those other people that keep coming to the cafe that are like dancing everywhere and like kind of taunting her with like the threat of her playing the piano, which I like. When you see more of her piano playing, I feel like it's kind of rude what they're saying. And so to see this guy come in and be so kind is so wonderful. But also I like to see that she also opens him up. Like, I think that they're very good for each other in a way where like he's kind of like, slow down, I can help you. Like you're not alone. You I got this. Like if Peter's not here, I got this. Like you don't, at the same way, like she's like, you can dance. You're dancing when she says you're dancing. Like that scene is so beautiful because I bet you there's been a time in the past when like Phil is like, don't dance, or like, because I noticed in this watch, like when all the guys, all the ranch hands are like at the bar or whatever, Phil's just sitting there like a bump on a log, like not dancing, not doing anything. And I bet you there's been times where like Phil's like, men don't do that, like just sit down, like that's the vibe you get. So to have somebody that's like letting George be whoever he wants to be, or like have fun and be playful, is just so joyous. And I feel like when we see Rose and George at the end, like from the window, and we just see them like kissing and embracing, it's just, you're like, they're going to have a positive marriage. Like their little family unit is going to be okay now. And I love that.
And it didn't feel tacked on. It felt like this is the right ending for them. And you see that in Peter's little smile at the end, where he's like, I took care of you, Mom. You don't ever need to know what I did, but we'll be okay now. Yeah. So I love that. I'm curious to know how you feel about because you talked about the piano. Piano is a running theme through almost all of her work. She's obsessed with pianos, plays a really big part in this story. And I haven't read the book, so I don't know if this is in there or to what extent, but how do you feel about the scene where he has the governor and his wife come over and his parents, and he's asked her prior to this to play the piano and she practices because that leads to the initial break. How do you feel about him kind of pushing it and your reading on that?
Like George pushing it or Phil pushing it?
George.
I think George wants her to be able to show her stuff and also come a little bit out of her shell, because we see her interacting with his parents and the governor, and she's like a little awkward. Like she's there holding the drinks and she's like, I don't really know what to do. So I think he's like, well, if she's not so comfortable socializing, maybe she can play the piano and that's something she's comfortable with doing. So I think what his pushing was like more innocent, like he just didn't know. And that's part of the problem of like marrying somebody that you don't know that well. Like you haven't had a chance to really know what their talents are or what their comfort levels are or their boundaries are. And I think like she wanted to impress them. Like you see her practicing, you know, but I think like playing piano for drunken people at a cafe that like maybe aren't really listening to you, or drunken people, or, you know, people that are watching a movie at a cinema, because that's what she does as a job as well, is accompanying films, like is different than like 4 people watching you and listening intently to you playing piano. And so I think George's intents were good, but he did fuck up. And then of course Phil comes into the picture and is just being a total dickhead, like humming and whistling the song that she's been practicing. So freaking rude. I can't stand that man. So George innocent, Phil not innocent.
I agree, 100%. I think it was totally innocent. I don't think he was being like, you need to be a certain way. I think he 100% was just like, he thought it would make her happy to be able to show that part of herself because she is a little shy and a little awkward, to be honest. He obviously learned from that, and he didn't say anything after she decided to not play. And that's how I know he wasn't just like, you know, taking her aside to be like, you know, I promised them this. He's like, okay, it's fine. And then Phil comes and obviously ruins her entire evening. Just the look on her face, you just feel so much for her. There's a scene prior to that where she's practicing and he's playing the same tune on the banjo and just taunting her and mocking her. And you're like, man, this guy's a massive piece of shit. Yeah. Like just the absolute worst, which like brings us to Rose and Phil, because their first scene together, she calls him, you know, brother Phil. And he's like, I'm not your brother. And he calls her a cheap schemer is what he says. Mm-hmm. And just imagine that's the first time you meet. Well, they've met before, obviously at the cafe, but this is the first time they're meeting as 2 people in the house. And to be told that, knowing that we all know that she's obviously not a schemer at all. She didn't plan any of this. He knows too, but he's pushing her. Their relationship is the most toxic because it's toxic one-sided from on his side, and he really pushes her to a dark place where I guess it's maybe alluded to that she might have had an alcohol problem prior, maybe after her previous husband, and she eventually got over that. I only say that because at one point Peter sees the bottle in her bed and he kind of pushes away, not to make her feel bad. So I think he knows that she's had this previous problem, but pushes her to a point where she just wants to forget. George is away for a little while in this film, quite a while, to the point when he comes back, I was like, oh yeah, I forgot that you were away this whole time. She gets really bad, and it's really sad to see her downfall. You just see the physical drain it takes on her body. So how do you read the way their relationship progresses and just how it's really bad from the start and just gets worse and worse? Yeah, I mean, I think he's trying to intimidate her because number one, that's his MO. Like he just wants to intimidate everybody and assert power over everybody. Like the only person that has power over him, he thinks, is was Bronco Henry, who he brings up constantly, but he asserts his power over her like immediately when the first time when they interact, which is behaving so inappropriately at the table, and setting those flowers on fire and putting them in the water jug. He puts it out in the water jug, which I was like, well, great, that water's like, she can't use that water now. Like,
great. You're just being a total dick. But I think his whole thing is to chip her down. And I think he hopes that one day she'll just leave and it'll be him and George again. Like that's his ultimate hope. And I think he sees over time that George is not going to like back down, that like he's committed to this relationship. So what can he do but, cut this woman down to size? And she's a woman after all. So he assumes that he can do that. And it just kills me because like she seems so happy in other ways. And then all of a sudden she's broken down like this.
Yeah.
And she's ashamed too, where like when Phil catches her like drinking, immediately, oh, he's going to use this. Like he's taking this knowledge and he's going to use it against her. It's just so upsetting. And Kristen Dunst, like she is so exceptional in this role. Like I love her so much. I think we all do.
Mm-hmm.
But like she really, really has, in other movies, she has this like bratty sort of like over the top quality, but here she's so insular and so like scared and, withdrawn in a way that I don't think we get to see her be so often. And it is really, you just feel so bad for her when she's like, when that scene when she like is drinking and then she like has to hide it from George, like just like quickly, it's so upsetting. And it just makes you want to kill Phil, which is so interesting.
Yeah.
Because luckily, he gets his just desserts, but what he puts her through is it's standard toxic masculinity is essentially what it is.
It's exactly that. Even when he sees her drinking, he starts humming that tune and she's hearing it. She's questioning herself. Am I hearing this or what? Because he's stopping it and starting it. And it's just like, this man is so calculated. He's not just like randomly being a piece of shit. Like this man is calculating every single move. And he knows what he's going to do. And it's scary. And when you see, because you mentioned the fear that she has with the blossoming relationship that Peter and Phil have. And when they ride off together, the fear that she has, and she's just crying. She's saying to George, I don't want them together. Because anyone would just be like, I don't know what this man's planning on doing if they're going off together. So it's really sad to see what happens there. But thankfully, we get some relief in the end, much deserved relief. But one of the other relationships that I wanted to talk about, which seems a little smaller because they really don't interact much, but I found it interesting on this watch how little they interact, was George and Peter, because they are essentially stepson, stepfather at this point, but they don't really have any scenes together. They don't talk about each other. Peter kind of mentions, because she asked him to leave his school books or his medical books, and he's like, well, these are dad's, so they got to stay at school. He doesn't really want them there, but they don't really talk to each other. They don't really acknowledge each other. And it's interesting to see the fact that that wasn't used as a way for Peter to try and get out of the house. He's got bigger problems, obviously, because there's someone who's actually antagonistic towards him. But how do you feel about that fact that that's really not explored, their relationship at all?
Yeah, it's interesting because you'd think, especially given the fact that like Peter's dad died in such a dramatic way, that like there could be something to like sort of chew on there in terms of like daddy issues and like the trauma that came with that, and maybe that is a little bit of it, is that like he's like a little bit standoffish to this new guy, whether he likes it or not. But I think like Peter is really just like an observer, and that's like kind of his power. And so I think like he's kind of still probably like observing and judging George a little bit to be like, is this guy good? Because like I care about my mom first and foremost. And I don't know that like I want to get super close to this person, because who knows what's going to happen. He knows what happens to his dad, and he knows that, loss can happen at any time. So I think that could be part of it. But I also think like his number one priority, him being Peter, is his mom. So I think like he's more focused on her than anything. And so like staying around with Phil, for example, as opposed to like maybe going off with George, would be his priority because he wants to protect her. And so I imagine, I don't know if you feel this way, but I imagine that like George and Peter would have a much like better and productive relationship after Phil's out of the picture, because they could both be themselves and not have to hide. Because I think like George is hiding or was sort of like holding himself back being around Phil. And I think him and Peter could have a really wonderful relationship. I believe that. Like I could see, George really supporting his artistic side in the same way that he supports, Rose's artistic side in trying to get her to play the piano. But I don't know. Like, do you get the impression that like they could have a good relationship?
I think very much. And I think that's why that final shot is so powerful, where he's the one looking down and watching them kiss. And you're watching him watching them. And when he turns around, he's smiling. And I think that means that he knows his mother is safe and in good hands. And I think you're right, where he is kind of apprehensive about George, but not in a way where he finds him to be a threat. He's just more like, what's the deal with the situation we're in? How long can my mom withstand living in this house with this other person? Will she leave? Do I need to make and have a relationship with this man? And he doesn't view him as a threat, so he doesn't need to focus on his energy on her and like saving his mom from George, because he loves her and he knows that George loves her. I thought that's actually an interesting point, because I just was like, I don't understand why we're not getting really any scenes of them talking to each other. But I think it's also good that there's no scenes where he's participating in making fun of him. And oftentimes, even there's a great scene where Peter's walking along and all the ranch hands are calling him all these ugly names. And we get a shot of Rose looking worried, and there's a shot also of George looking worried. And that's how you know, okay, he doesn't have a problem with Peter at all. And I think they will have a really great relationship after, which I like to think in my mind's Power of the Dog too.
Yeah. Waiting for it. Jane, where's Power?
Yeah. Those are the relationships. But you also mentioned Bronco Henry, who's someone we don't see. Obviously, he's passed on, a very important part of this story, incredibly important part, and ties into the queer storyline of this film that is at times in the background, at times it's very overt. And we get it through the two characters, Peter and Phil, in very different ways. It's a little bit more overt with Peter. It's not ever said what his preference is, what it doesn't matter. That's how people view him. Phil's obviously the complete opposite. He embodies someone who would never consider that. And we find out that's different. That's not factual at all.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're watching this, you don't know anything about it. You're wondering, why does this man keep talking about Bronco Henry? What's the deal? And then we get a really fantastic scene where there's a bunch of the ranch hands in the water, they're bathing, and then he goes off on his own. That's where I bring in the Yentl stuff, because there's a great scene in Yentl where I was like, that's one of my all-time favorite scenes in cinema. I thought it's so beautifully shot, where I'm like, I could only aspire to shoot a scene like this. And when I saw Power of the Dog for the first time, I was like, oh my God, Yentl, that's the scene. She does it so well in it. She does it so well here. But then we get the scene where he's lying down, he's caressing his body. He's like from top up, like shirtless, and he's caressing his body with this cloth. And then there's that quick little shot of the BH, and you're like, oh, I know what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that scene and the reveal and the choice to reveal it that way?
I love that scene. Number one, I love queerness in any film. Anytime there's a queer twist, I am on board. I'm just like, absolutely yes. And I definitely, before I saw that scene, I was like, something's going on with him. Why does he keep talking about Bronco Henry? Like, and he's not at the bar. He wasn't engaging with any of the girls. Like, I was like, I clocked him, I think, pretty early in the film. But so I love that scene with Phil just enjoying himself, because I think it's like a moment of him just like allowing himself to be himself and to give himself over to the pleasure that he obviously feels for Bronco Henry, felt for him. It's like and it's gorgeously shot scene of just like him lying in alone.
Yeah.
But I think it is such an encapsulation of him that like he can only be that way in private. Like he would never want to expose that part of himself. And the fact that he's doing that while the other guys are like naked, swimming, like maybe he was a little bit like aroused by that experience and then had to go away and deal with it his own way. So I love that scene. And I also love that, we see Peter sort of observe this, and that's sort of his way of being like, oh, I know what the deal is. And now I have some information that I can use to my advantage, because I already know that this guy thinks that I'm queer. So, and he is queer. So, I can do something with this. And then the next scene is Phil being like, oh, I'm actually going to be nice to this guy now because he has information on me. But also, you're probably like, maybe he can get something out of it, because his relationship with Bronco Henry was obviously one, like, I assume that Bronco Henry kind of like groomed him into this situation, because we see also the magazines with the porn that Peter finds, and that you're like, those were Bronco Henry's magazines, you know, and he probably showed them to Phil and then just showed him the way, so that now Phil is so like taken with Bronco Henry that he can't help but mention him at any opportunity. And also, he seductively cleans that saddle that used to belong to Bronco Henry. That, like, you know, it's so obvious. Like, I don't know how anybody else isn't seeing that this man is in love with a dead man.
He really does bring him up at any opportunity, to the point where you're like, sure, we get it. You're in love, which is fine. I actually hadn't read it as him grooming, but I was like, that makes total sense, because he obviously would have been much older than him. And like, I wonder what the age difference would have been. It's really interesting. And then the flip of the switch with him and Peter, when they go off together, he's like, oh, Bronco Henry was about your age too when he started writing. So he starts comparing the two, and I was like, oh my God, here we go. So he's going to start doing onto Peter what was done to him. And it's just, it's subtle, but it's also overt enough where you're like, okay, I know where we're going from here. And Peter, same way you clocked it, I'm sure Peter did right away, where he's like, okay, as he said, I know what to do with this information and how to use it to my advantage. And it's just so well done. And it never feels forced, and it never feels like, I don't know, like, I think another filmmaker wouldn't make it that storyline so beautiful. I think they would kind of punish Phil for being closeted and just being so angry that he just doesn't know how to express himself. But I think the way she shoots it and tells the story, kind of, that's the only empathetic thing that you can have for him, where this is a man who just doesn't know how to express himself. And I don't think that justifies his behavior at all, but you can kind of feel for that part because of the time that he's living in and the way he was raised, unfortunately. So it's a really good aspect of the story that most people enjoyed. Some other people, famous and not famous, obviously didn't like at all. Who will go unnamed, Sam Elliott. But I think it's just beautiful. And again, Jane is the person to do this, because she handles everything with such grace, and you never feel as though she's judging even the ugliest of characters. She's just honest, and sometimes brutally honest.
Yeah, and she's like showing you, not telling, which is like such a cliche, but it's so true that like it's not said that he's queer. You just see. You just it's expressed to you, and you do with that information what you will. You know, and I just love that. There's no like big reveals. It's just this like subtle reveal. And I think that is so powerful, because that's how it would be in real life too. Like, that guy's never going to admit to that. He's not going to have a conversation about it. It's just going to be something that somebody like accidentally observes, because he's kept it so close to the chest.
It just wouldn't have worked if there was a huge reveal. Even if it was the case of Peter calling him out on it, that would have ended very badly for Peter. So I'm glad it didn't go that route. Just really well done. And she's working within the Western genre, which is not a genre we get often anymore. I'm a huge fan of Westerns, problematic genre, but then there's gems throughout that are really progressive because it's such a problematic genre. And this is a progressive one. There's talks of, when genres that are not done as often anymore, of like revisionist film. This sometimes is considered revisionist Western. I think it's just a straight up Western that she's telling her story through. So how do you feel about that? Like, I don't think she's defying the conventions of the genre. She's just telling a story that might not be told that often in the genre, but it's still a Western.
Yeah, it's definitely a Western. It has all like the trademarks, like just like these like people living in this ranch, and the new person comes in and dealing with that. Like, I think that queer element is, you know, a little bit different, and it brings it more into today, but the story is not new. It's not a new story. It was written years ago, and it was written by a gay man. So, and we were talking before we started recording that there's like a little like a bonus feature thing on Netflix that you can watch after The Power of the Dog, which has like footage of Jane directing. And at one point in that, she says that Thomas Savage was like a feminine presence in a masculine world. And like in that way, I think that like that makes me the perfect person to tell this story because I am a feminine presence in a masculine world. And I think like, yes, a woman telling a Western is feminist in its own way. And those are my favorite Westerns too, are like ones that are made by women or about women. But I think this is a movie that like I would recommend. My dad loves Westerns. Like he is like, unfortunately, he loves John Wayne. And that is like, he even admits as somebody who is conservative as hell, like he admits that John Wayne is a problematic man, but he loves John Wayne movies. And this is a movie I would still recommend to my dad who like loves the old school Westerns, do you know? And he might not love the gay twist, but I don't think it's not so outrageous that I think he would like have a problem with it. I think it would just fit into the rest of the canon because the fact is there's people made such a big deal about Brokeback Mountain, which is one of my absolute favorite movies at the time. But like, obviously there were gay cowboys. There were like queer people existed in all time, you know? Just because it wasn't always presented doesn't mean that it didn't exist.
Truly. And like, as someone who also likes the old school Westerns with newer eyes and more modern eyes that I'm looking at through, sometimes you see stuff in films that probably wouldn't have been read that way then because they would have been like, absolutely not. But then you're like, I see what you're doing here with these characters. And I know that was probably the intention, but hoping that no one would notice. And I also agree. I love the ones that are either made by women or starring women, especially women like, you know, Joan Crawford, Barbara Stanwyck. Like, those are the best ones. So, because even those sometimes get labeled as like revisionist Westerns. I'm like, no, it's just a Western. It just happens to be about a woman. Like, it's not revisionist at all.
No.
I agree. I think this is a straight up Western. And I love that you said that you would recommend it to someone who loves older Westerns or like the more formulaic ones, because I think this just stands on its own as one that is a Western. And for a genre that doesn't get done anymore as often, for a woman to do it, I think it's just another step into why Jane is just so great and can really do anything. Are there any parts of the story or themes that we haven't chatted about that you want to bring up?
I just think like I love a quiet reveal. And I just think that this movie does that so expertly where like it sticks with you. Like one of my favorite authors of all time is Shirley Jackson. And I feel like she is a master of the like silent reveal or like the like twist ending that you're like, the pearl clutcher. That's what I call it. The pearl, like it's a pearl clutcher. And I think that this movie is a pearl clutcher in so many ways, which I absolutely love, where you're like, oh dear, like really that's happening. Like to me, that like final moment of the like showdown between Phil and Peter, when he's like, you're gonna watch me braid this rope, and they exchange a cigarette. Like that is such, in another movie, it would be like a literal showdown, like two guys with guns ablazing at each other. But this is just like a quiet moment, but it has so much tension in it. And I think like that is so incredible. And it's just subtly revealed, oh, like we think he had anthrax. And the reason he had anthrax is because of the hides that Peter gave him. Like it's just beautiful in its like subtlety. And I just love that like soft twist of the knife that I think Jane does so well. But like I think just women do that so well. Like it's subtlety. And I think subtlety is the big thing about this movie that I think works so well. I'm
glad that you brought that up, because especially that cigarette sharing scene where I was like, oh my God, this is so beautifully shot. Like it kind of felt like in that little moment, a noir where they're just kind of enveloped in black and the cigarette smoke going back and forth. And I was like, oh my God, like, it's so good. And then as the story goes on, there's that great shot of him washing his hands in the blood in the water and the rope. And as he gets sick, and then you're like, wait a minute. I think I didn't get that was what's going to happen at all. And I just remember being like, wait a minute, did he plan this whole time? And then you think back and you're like, all the clues were there.
Yeah.
But even on like a rewatch, it still is so great to just see. Then you can clock and be like, oh, I see where you started this. Like you've been playing this for a hot minute.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And even the end shot when you see him like holding the rope in his room and he's got the gloves on. And I was like, that's such a small, subtle thing. Yeah, he won't touch that because it's infected and he knows. But he's gonna keep that. That's like a prize of what he did, you know? That's like his prize, his tainted prize. And it's like delicious. It's just delicious.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. And I like that you said that it's a prize because it's very much that where he's like, I'm not going to give this up. And I know, to keep it away from other people touching it and from myself touching it. And it is really delicious where you're like, you know what? He got what he deserves. He probably deserved way more than that. But that's a great ending for that character. And it's not even like an overtly super happy ending, but you feel, as we've been saying, comforted by the fact that these people can now just relax and live their lives. So I love that for them. And I love that for this movie. And as you said, Jane's such a great writer. Subtlety is really her forte.
Yeah. I like to doodle when I watch movies. It's just like a thing that I do. And my doodles are like hats, some boots, a bunch of paper flowers, the little purse, the little leather purse that Rose has.
Oh, yes. Okay.
A bundle of flowers, because that's what she brings when she first comes.
Mm-hmm.
And just like a rendering of Rose as a character, because I loved her hair in it. Just to be a little bit like superficial for a moment, I just thought she looked great. And I love the costume work on this film on Kristen Dunst. Like she just, that like 20s style really suits her. It just beautiful.
It does. She was wearing some really great shoes at some point too that I really clocked where I was like, oh wow, those are great. And someone really took the time to find. It was like set of the time. I was like, you cannot find shoes like that anymore. You couldn't find shoes like 10 years after that. So I love that you do. That's really cool. I love that it's on brand with everything in the film. So yeah, I think we covered Power of the Dog. We can move to the last segment where we'll still talk about Jane. We'll still talk about Power of the Dog, but there's two more questions that I have for you. First being, as someone who's watched enough Campion films that you have a good scope of what she's capable of and what she has to offer. If someone came up to you and asked for a recommendation on where to start, they've never seen anything by her before, what film are you recommending and what's the reasoning behind that recommendation?
Like, I know this is a basic answer, but it's The Piano because I just think it is such an encapsulation of everything that she brings to the table. And I think it is a movie that would convince you to watch the rest of her work because it's so, so powerful and like visually arresting and emotional. And I just think it is the perfect entry point to her and understanding why she's such a force in this industry. But also, I just think if you haven't seen The Piano, you absolutely need to see it. Like Holly Hunter is so incredible in it. And also you need to see how hot Harvey Keitel is. Like you need to see it. So I think it's important, but I do think that it is just a wonderful piece of work. And it might be her most like well-known piece of work up until maybe Power of the Dog now. But I think it is just that exceptional that it is the way to get into Jane.
I mean, 100% agree. And every other guest I have had on also would agree. Where this is the only filmmakers I've covered so far where everyone's answer was the same, like it's an obvious one. And I don't think it's because it's her biggest one. I think it's because that's the film that defines what she has to offer. And I think when you're recommending a film to someone who's never seen, you have to give them that film that shows you exactly who they are, what they do. And then you can branch off. You can branch off to Bright Star, then you can go Holy Smoke, In the Cut. For you to start it In the Cut, I would be like, well, she only has a couple movies like this that are abrasive. So you're not getting the full scope of her. And it might put you off if you're not familiar or ready for it. I think it's great. I love In the Cut. I really do. The Piano would be my automatic recommendation. I'd just be like, even if it wasn't, I would just in the sense that, as you said, you have to watch The Piano. Like, you have to see it because it's just beautiful, immaculate work. And you get some Harvey Keitel action in there too. So no complaints all around. Great film. But in terms of Power of the Dog, if you're making a double bill, what film or films would you pair this one with? And what's the thematic reasoning behind the double bill?
Okay, so this question really threw me for a loop because I had so many thoughts. So I have three answers, and I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
please. No, please give me as many as you want.
My automatic first thought was McCabe and Mrs. Miller. And
Okay.
the reason I say that is I feel like you're a fan of it, and just I have a vibe that you like McCabe and Mrs. Miller. But I think Jesse Plemons wears a like fur coat at one point that really reminds me of the one that Warren Beatty wears in McCabe and Mrs. Miller. That's the first. But also, I think that McCabe and Mrs. Miller is like a really interesting film about gender and gender roles and gender expectations. And I think that this film also plays with that and is about like a very small setting and just the things that go on in this one particular area and these particular people. So that is why I said McCabe, Mrs. Miller. But then I thought more about it and I said Brokeback Mountain, which I already mentioned. And the reason I say that, of course, there's the queerness, but it's going back to those quiet reveal moments that when I saw the scene of Phil seeing Rose drinking in the alleyway reminded me of the scene where Alma sees Jack and Innes kissing in Brokeback, and how that was a pearl clutcher. Also, I remember being in the theater at the Cumberland downtown, which used to exist. I made my mom take me opening weekend to see Brokeback, and everyone was like gasping in that scene. And so I think of those moments and the way that somebody withholds themselves and how that damages them. Like, I think Brokeback would be like a very good complement to this. Also based on a book. I just think like a lot of threads are similar. Whereas like Brokeback does it a little more overt. This is a little more subtle, but they're both subtle movies overall and very quietly moving movies. My last like really crazy option to complete the set is Ravenous, which is an Antonio Bird movie, which I know sounds nuts, but if you haven't seen it, it's a cannibal horror western. But I think that movie is the like extreme heightened version of this in terms of like competition between men and like latent homosexuality. And so those are my answers.
No, I think those are all very good and would make for like perfect double bills. I think actually Altman and Campion are good pairings just in general. Very different filmmakers, but can be subtle at times. Altman does have times where he can be subtle. So I think that's great. And Brokeback Mountain is also great. I've been meaning to rewatch that because I haven't seen it in like probably 10 years, to be honest. It's been a long time. Ravenous is, that's funny. I think that's great. That would make for a fun night.
Wouldn't it?
I think. Yeah.
Like, I don't know. You maybe watch Power of the Dog first, like, you know, like,
I think so. Yeah.
And then it's like a midnight movie, Ravenous. You're just like, let's just crank it up.
Yeah, truly. I think that's the way to go. And it would be a fun night. We're like, okay, gonna get the chips out because to watch a cannibal movie.
I also just had to throw a female filmmaker in there, and that was part of my Ravenous thought. If I was like another woman who did westerns and did it in a different way, I was like, why not?
I love that. I wish I had thought of another woman, but I did not. I have two choices on mine, and one which I recently watched for the first time called The Westerner. It's William Wyler in 1940, and it stars Gary Cooper, who kind of plays a little bit of a Peter-esque character where he's an outsider coming in and everyone's kind of like, what's going on with this guy? And there's a couple scenes in that film, one that really kind of shocked me only because it was in the 1940s where Gary Cooper wakes up in a bed with another man and they're cuddling each other because they got drunk the night before. But there's a great shot where like William Wyler's like lingering on the fact that they're asleep for a while and they're holding each other in bed. And I was just like, this is 1940 and Gary Cooper's a huge star, you know, but there's more subtle things throughout, but that's the one that's like very overt about that character. We're like, okay, I see what you guys are doing here, William. Like, I think it's great. Like, I just remember being like, I cannot believe this passed the censors in 1940. So that was one. Another one that was more on the toxic masculinity side. This would be a long double bill because this movie's like 3 hours long. you're gonna have to start this one during the day and end it with Power on the Dog. But I thought of Giant, the George Stevens film, and Phil just reminded me of James Dean's character in that film, where he's just like an insane amount of anger that just builds and builds to the point where you're like, man, you need to just relax for a bit, because it's just like the vitriol that those two characters have. I think Phil's nastier than James Dean's character in that, but also visually, the two films, huge, beautiful, vast landscapes, and also you get to see Liz Taylor and Rock Hudson. So there's no complaints. That's one of my all-time favorite movies, but it's a time commitment. And Power of the Dog's not short either. Although I feel like it goes by very fast, I will say. I agree. So those would be my choices.
I like those. I watched Giant at the Paradise, which is a local theater here.
Well, I was also there then.
You were?
Yeah, because I saw it. It was like during the day, right?
Yeah.
Over the summer. Yeah, I was there. I brought my partner who had never seen it, and I'd been telling him for years. I was like, I love this movie, Giant. And when it was playing, I was like, I have to see it. And I was like, oh man, he's going to be so bored. He watches movies too, but like 3 hours, as you say, is a commitment. And I was just shocked how much he loved it. And I was like, well, I told you. I told you it's great. It was great to see it in the cinema. There was a man there with his young daughter who was, I'm really bad at telling kids' age. I want to say she was like 10, 11. And she sat through the whole thing. And I was like, oh my God. I felt so emotional. I was like, that's so beautiful.
Yeah.
See, a father and his daughter coming to see Giant.
I know that's so sweet. And like to think that she could watch that whole thing, like that's a cinephile in training. You know what I mean?
Truly.
Like, yeah, because I know other kids. I was just talking with somebody about this day. Like I know kids that they can't sit through a movie. They can't sit through an 80-minute movie, let alone a 3-hour movie. So I'm glad to see that kids are still getting into old movies.
Yeah. I was like, wow, I'm so excited for you, because you've got like a really great, life ahead of you, and obviously great parents who support and are showing you the good stuff. So I love that. That was one of my favorite summer moments. But thank you, Emily, so much for joining me for Power of the Dog. I thought it was a great conversation, and we weren't even that mean to Phil. He deserved more. But, sometimes you gotta talk about the nicer people in a story. But thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. And I'll just say it. Fuck you, Phil. You suck.
Yeah.
I'm glad you died. Okay.
Truly. Same.
Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia with intro music by The Marwalker. If you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesinmovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacesinmovies@gmail.com. And while you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcast. And stay tuned for our next episode on Holy Smoke.